In this lecture on new theories and methods in urbanization studies, Dr. Karen Seto highlights the changing character of contemporary cities and their connectivity to other places. She first focuses on historical theorists and practitioners who work to understand and design cities, and notes that there was a shared conception of cities as distinct spaces separated from rural areas. She notes that current urbanization trends are more varied and heterogeneous than this historical model, and she links this diversity to questions about sustainability in cities. She poses the question of if and when cities contribute to or hinder global sustainability, and presents examples of different types of urban planning and policy that lead to different outcomes and impacts. She highlights as well the need for new thinking about the spatial configuration of urban and rural places, and suggests that moving from a dichotomous understanding to one based on a spectrum better captures current land use and land change trends. She concludes with the proposition that we need new theories about urbanization and its social and environmental impacts, especially in the context of global emphasis on human well-being through efforts like the Sustainable Development Goals.
I have three main take-home points from today's talk, and I'm just going to tell you up front. So one is that so much of what we know about urbanization and cities does not apply today. That's pretty easy to remember. So we need, the last talk ended with Steve's question of where's like the new frontier? And I'm here to say that there's a huge new frontier for all of you working in other non-urban systems to connect to urban systems. Because so much of what we know, so many of the theories and the paradigms and the frameworks that we use are based on urban processes that happened several centuries ago in a very different context. They don't apply today. So that's easy to remember. The second main point that I want to tell you is that what we do know about urbanization, and especially urbanization in the context of SE interactions, is limited to a few places. So we know a lot about a few megacities, a few samples here and there, but we actually don't know very much about the large sample of cities around the world. So like if you were an ecologist, would you only sample the lakes in your backyard? You probably wouldn't, right? But we basically keep sampling the same cities: New York, Shanghai, Beijing, etc. So we don't know a lot about the rest of the world. That's my second take-home point. And then my third take-home point is that urbanization is a multi-dimensional process. It's not just people moving into cities, although I just had a huge debate with someone about what is urbanization. And he was making the argument that urbanization, the classic definition is the increase in the percentage of a nation's population that lives in urban areas. So it's strictly defined as this demographic process. But we know actually that urbanization is this multidimensional process. It is about changes in culture and traditions. It is about changes in lifestyles, norms, attitudes, behavior. Cities concentrate people, right? They concentrate people, and they concentrate ideas, and out from that comes, well, we need very different institutions and laws to regulate all these different people, to maintain law and order, but also regulations around food and sanitation, around how to behave. And so urbanization is actually a transformation about society, about how we're living, what we value. And it's not just about more people living in cities. And it is that classic definition of urbanization that I would argue has hampered a lot of progress in urban research, because we think about it as only this demographic phenomenon, not as this multi-dimensional phenomenon. So I'm here to make the argument that we need to really rethink urbanization. So here are a few of my favorite statistics that that I think are not as well known. So we're talking about this pretty large-scale transition, right? Every week, about 1.3 million people, the growth of urban areas. So it's a large-scale transition that's happening everywhere. But urban areas are engines of growth around the world. In some countries, like in Thailand, Bangkok generates more than 50% of the GDP. So the issue of urban primacy It's not about apes, actually. Primacy is about how important is that one single city, the largest city often. But globally, we know that cities generate the majority of economic growth. And at the same time, if we think about the global environment, the planet, we know that urban areas use the majority of the planet's resources. So I think there are two big questions that, despite centuries of research on cities and urban economics and urban geography, urban sociology, we don't understand these two very basic questions. What drives urbanization? And this requires us to think, how do we define urbanization? If we think about it only as this demographic transition, then we're looking for certain types of answers. But if we think about urbanization as this multidimensional process of institutions, of policies, of lifestyles, economy, social interactions become very different, then the drivers become very different, and where we look for solutions become very different. And then the question of how does urbanization affect the environment? Decades of research in this sphere has focused on the co-location of cities and their immediate environment. So, in fact, when I was hired by Yale, my original title was a professor of the urban environment. And I said, well, I'm not studying the urban environment. I'm actually thinking about the global environment. And yet, there's lots of literature that talks about the local urban environment. And so that ends up being literature and articles on sewage and local pollution, air quality, indoor air quality. And the framing is very important because framing leads to funding, and funding, I think, sometimes leads to solutions, or lack of funding, I think, also leads to lack of really innovative, holistic solutions. But so much of our framing has been very small scale. Anybody recognize anybody here? Anybody in this room? Okay, so one person, so a few people. Okay, well, this is good. Not everyone knows everybody, but I'm not going to go through all of these folks, but these are kind of canons in urban studies, or folks who've written canons in urban studies, right? So whether it's in urban economics or geography or sociology, you can turn to the literature and read about these big ideas around how cities grow, what makes life in cities different and viable and attractive. For every single one of these scholars, this is the dominant conceptualization of the city that they're talking about. It may not have a wall, but it is this distinct place that's different from what everyone else studies. So there's urban and there's everything else that's non-urban. And this is part of the challenge in the dominant literature, is that we think about cities as these places, as these confined locations. If you look at these different literatures, whether it's from economics or engineering or ecology, you'll get very different ideas about the role of urbanization in planetary scale sustainability. I don't mean local sustainability, I mean like planetary scale. On the one hand, there's a rich literature largely from economics. Let me start with the bad things from ecology, actually, and environmental sciences that really focus on more the pollution and the crisis aspect of urbanization. Right? So a lot of research on the land components of urbanization and how land affects local biogeochemistry and hydrology, surface energy balance and albedo and biodiversity and habitats and fragmentation of landscape. Lots of literature in that sphere. And if you read that literature, you think urbanization, this transition of 1.5 or 1.3 million people moving into urban areas is going to be a crisis and a disaster for the planet and humanity. So you read this other literature, and this is from economics primarily, but also some from geography and sociology, and you get a very different framing. So we see that cities are sites of innovation. Lots of literature in economics about how you need the clustering in concentration of ideas for people to come up with. I mean, look at us. We're like tightly packed in this room. Density is good for some things, but apparently not others. So cities offer much more efficient delivery of sanitation, of health, certainly clean water. Lots of research that shows that cities are engines of economic growth. I already showed some global statistics earlier. Some countries like China now have a very explicit policy to try to move 300 million people into cities over the next 20 years because the central government thinks that by moving people into cities, by building cities, it's going to lift the entire country out of poverty. So there are a lot of different ideas about whether urbanization is a crisis or whether it's an opportunity. And there's no clear answer because it really depends on the literature that you decide to read. I want to just make the argument that because of these 5 different things, the scale of urbanization, the rate, the location, form, and as well as changes in urban life, these 5 changes signal really a big change from urban processes in the past. And I just want to highlight a couple of these. And one is the issue of scale. So if we look at cities like Beijing or Shanghai, these are cities that are very large, so like mega cities of 21 and 25 million people. So these are cities of a size that we actually have not seen before. And managing these cities creates very new challenges that historically we haven't had to deal with. Australia has only 23 million people. So how do we design governance systems and institutions, and maybe Oren has some answers for us, to govern people in such compact areas? What are the legal structures that need to be in place? How do we rethink issues around safety and law and order? So the scale, the absolute size of these cities are very different now. The rate of change is very different. So it used to be that it took 20 plus years for the global urban population to increase by 1 billion. But now our urban population globally is increasing by 1 billion about every 13 years. Now that's going to plateau, right? The most recent UN estimate suggests that by 2050, the urban population will reach about 6.5 billion out of about 9.5 billion people. So that's about 65-ish% of humanity will live in these urban places. But the rate of change is increasing, and there's lots of literature from folks like Jeff West and Luis Benacourt that's showing that the pace of life in cities is actually faster as cities get bigger. So there's interesting work that shows like metabolism rates of people in cities, pace of life in terms of how fast you're walking in bigger cities is faster than in smaller cities. So pace, the rate of change is increasing and becoming quicker. There's a big change in location of urbanization. It used to be, 100 years ago, that urbanization was strongly coupled with development, economic development. And we only saw large cities, with a few exceptions in Asia. We only really saw large cities where there was strong economic development. And so you had large cities in Europe, a few in North America. But now if we look into the future, we'll see that the very largest cities are going to be in emerging economies, developing countries, and the global south. And it's also in these places where the rule of law is weaker, where we have fewer institutions and governance to deal with urban planning, zoning, issues of law and order. So there's a huge change in the geographic location of urbanization going forward in this century. And if we put it in the context of, again, policies and rule of law, we're talking about very different types of cities. If I had $1 every time a journalist called me up and said, tell me the 10 most sustainable cities in the world, give me a list. If you look at those lists, almost always they include cities like Copenhagen, Stockholm. Sometimes there might be Tokyo, but it's New York. I mean, it's global north cities. I lived in Copenhagen for a sabbatical. I loved it. It's a beautiful city. But I'm going to tell you that Addis Ababa is not going to become like Copenhagen, okay? That's not going to happen. Mumbai is not going to be like Copenhagen. I mean, these are very different contexts, and we need to think about what sustainable urbanization means in these very different contexts. And that's why the change in geographic location is really important if we think about what's happening in the 21st century. There's a huge change in urban function, too. This is a different way to think about the third statistic that I showed, that basically urban areas are engines of global economic growth. But if you flip it around and you think about there's apparently an estimated 2 to 2.5 billion smallholder farmers in the world who cultivate farms of less than 2 hectares or smaller. Supposedly, so I say supposedly because these estimates are really large ranging, estimates of how much food they produce globally varies from 40% to 70% of the world's food supply. The bottom line is we're talking about a very small percentage of the world's economy, but actually affecting a lot of people globally. So, you think about another statistic that people like to talk about is, urban areas aren't really important because they only take up about 3% of the terrestrial surface. It's like, well, they're a small area, but it has big impact. It impacts probably 2 to 2.5 billion small-scale farmers. It impacts not just people in urban areas, but lots of livelihoods. I know a number of folks are interested in deforestation. That's for food, that's for timber, that's for resources often that go into cities. The other big change that we're seeing is changes in urban life. And here, because cities concentrate not only people, but cities represent flows of networks of ideas and transportation and infrastructure. We're seeing that ideas around urban living are really transmitted globally very quickly. I love to ask the question of where people think this is. And I'll ask that question here. It is in China. Most people, good job, right? Most people will say, well, it's, Southern California or, the cul-de-sacs or something. A few things do give it away. I think this dotted line separating the different lanes you probably wouldn't get in North America. But the single-family detached home, somebody said sprawl earlier, single-family detached home, single-use zoning. Zoning is a pretty new phenomenon, started in about early 20th century. But the idea of zoning has spread like wildfire around the world, and many new urban developments in China and in India actually have been fashioned or are being built after this idea of single-use, low-density development, which is a complete reversal of what cities used to be. Cities used to be actually concentrated, diverse economies, mixed uses, and we can have a whole debate about whether this is urbanization. But regardless of whether we think this is urbanization, it certainly is a very different lifestyle, land use, and if we think about the biogeochemistry and the ecology of this is certainly very different. So life is changing very quickly. The other big change is around diets. And here, the literature is quite interesting in terms of thinking about urbanization impacts or linkages with food systems. Most of the literature is focused on 2 aspects of urbanization and food. One, which I've contributed to, is looking at the direct impact of how urban expansion affects agricultural land. So most of these areas, especially in China, used to be farmland. So urban expansion leads to the loss of agricultural land. That's been documented all around the world and very acute in places like in Turkey, Vietnam, China. The other effect that has been widely documented is confounded with an income effect. So as people get richer, they have a land, water, and meat-based diet, right? A more energy-based diet. What's interesting, though, is, let me forward a little bit, there's some new work that's showing that's trying to link these two phenomenon together. So we see that, for example, the consumption of meat in China is increasing significantly. There's some new research that's actually linking that to deforestation in South America, especially in Brazil, and the export of soy, et cetera. But I think this is the new conceptual frameworks that we need to go to, moving away from simple ideas of urbanization just leads to the loss of agricultural land to much more textured, nuanced understanding of how these different dimensions of urbanization shape people's choices around whether it's food or consumption or lifestyles. So I have a proposal, which is that we need a different area of study, which a number of us have been calling, whether it's the science of the city or urban science or urbanization science. And so I have three questions here that set me up basically for why we need this. And the first question is, what does the urban century mean for planetary sustainability? So if you buy into the idea that we are living in an urban century, whether it's the demographic numbers or the economic numbers, what does it mean at the planetary scale? And very importantly, what do existing theories, those canons, tell us? So the canons tell us this. We need to think about urban. Urban is separate from rural. There's some new work that's being done that's introducing ideas of telecoupling and teleconnections. I don't know how many folks in this room are familiar with these ideas, but the idea that there's a continuum of land uses, that idea is not new, but the idea that we actually need to start understanding sending systems, systems that for certain contexts are sending systems, and other contexts they may be receiving systems. But we actually need to understand how these systems are coupled and create a much more complex understanding of what urbanization actually means. Another conceptualization that a number of us have been working on is, instead of thinking about urban impacts on the environment as direct and co-located, we may think of urban impacts on multiple rural or hinterland places or wildland places. And we know this to be true, but what methodologies do we have to start studying these multiple places? And from my perspective, I think, well, I know there are a couple of rural sociologists in the room. I think this is really interesting. How does one rural community, how are they affected by demands by multiple urban places? So just as one example, I have a colleague at Yale named Tom Gradle, and he's one of the world's experts on minerals and also rare earths. And his group has traced the use of rare earths in various aspects of the economy, and also traced geographically where they're available. And basically, one of the conclusions of the work there, key insights that his lab has generated, is that for many of modern technology, thinking about imaging in hospitals, turbines, a number of different things, they rely on rare earths that are actually only available in a few countries. So this was made really big news a few years ago when China said that it might limit the export of rare earths. This is an example where if we go beyond the example of rare earths and look at other systems or other resources, there are probably some resources that are only available in a few places. They're not interchangeable. And with growing demand, we're going to exact more higher demand on these single places. So that's another thing that we need to think about. And ultimately, if we start thinking about these places as connected globally, what are the frameworks and what are the methods that we have? There's some interesting work that's being done in operations research, looking at spatialized supply chains where you can actually look at different components of the supply chain. But that work isn't really coupled with SC work right now. It's pretty separate. So ultimately, many of us have been arguing that we need to move away from this framework where we're thinking about local hinterlands and really clear direct feedbacks to much more of a complex interaction that cover space. Now, clearly, we need to set some system boundaries for how we're going to study this. You can't just say, well, you know, everything is connected to everything else. But we certainly have to go beyond what we currently have now as conceptual frameworks and methods. So I would argue, and I'm not the only one saying this, that we actually need a lot of new paradigms to conceptualize and characterize these drivers, in far away or quote far away places. How do we conceptualize these sending places or sending systems versus receiving systems? How do we start accounting for the temporality of their impacts or their linkages when they're not co-located? When things are co-located, it's really easy, right? I build a city, I lose the ag land. But if we start thinking about diets and all the different supply chains that are associated with diets, refrigeration, cold storage, packaging, urbanization leads to the demand for more convenient things, more convenient foods, more convenient, more convenience in many different systems. So, second question that I have is, are we actually in a currently different era of urbanization from the past? And I hope one of the things that I've shown you with the examples is that we are in a different era. And if that's the case, do these theories apply? And how do they apply? How can we learn from them? I have a few examples of some agents of change that are not included in current theories about drivers of urbanization. So classic theory of urbanization is that people move into cities because of pull factors, because of jobs and opportunities, or they're pushed off the farm because of a number of different farm issues that, whether it's low productivity, low yields, whatever it may be. But people are either pushed off the farm or they're pulled into the city. But the idea is that it's very co-located. This is based on work that about 15 years of work in China and India and Vietnam, where repeatedly in field interviews and also meeting with policymakers, it became very clear that there were other agents that weren't being captured in theories, like international real estate companies. C.B. Richard Ellis is one of the world's largest real estate companies, and in 2009, they had $97 billion worth of real estate transactions. That's about the size of the GDP of Puerto Rico. Okay, I know Puerto Rico is a small country, but still, it's large. That's just one real estate company. These transactions are not only sell and lease, and there are a number of different real estate transactions, but there are also a number of different international real estate companies. We did a study in China and also in India working with Jones Lang LaSalle because we wanted to understand, how do companies like Microsoft, how do they acquire land? How do they decide where to develop? And how does the movement of one company like Microsoft lead to a domino effect in urban development? Well, it turns out that Microsoft works a lot with Jones Lang LaSalle. Jones Lang LaSalle goes to these different countries. They go to different, they have offices worldwide, and they negotiate with local farmers, or they negotiate with local policymakers. The point here is that there are these other agents, real estate companies, as well as international development firms. So nobody here, I saw in the bio, nobody here is from a design background that I could see, design or planning background. But these folks, Jurong International, Jurong basically designed Singapore. So if you've been to Singapore, you like what you see, you can hire Jurong. They have been exporting the Singapore model of urban development worldwide. Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, one of the largest design firms, they are having big impacts in small places. And what I mean by that is they may design only one building, but it's often an iconic building. It's often some aspirational building that a city mayor or maybe it's even a regional minister is really interested in showcasing that this is a city or an area that's moved into an era of modernity. So having a star architect, I don't know if you know that expression, but star architect come in and design an iconic airport or building or park leads to, they hope, other investments into an area, has quite a domino effect. So there are a number of actors that are not just the migrant workers moving into cities, and these have a very big impact on 21st century urbanization. Okay, here's another quiz. Where is this?
Southern California.
Southern California. Try Bangalore, India. Okay, so this is a development right outside of Bangalore. We did a project trying to understand, what drives urban development in India. Why does Microsoft go to India? Where do the workers live? Upper level management lives in places like these. Primarily they are non-resident Indians. So these are ethnically Indian folks who have moved back to India. They've been lured by Microsoft and Oracle. And this is one of my favorite quotes from that project where we interviewed a lot of different companies to understand, what is your global corporate strategy? How do you access land? Are you doing these studies? Like, how do you, I'm thinking Von Thunen, like, is it land price? How do you decide to go? And this CEO says, it's the lemming effect. When we see the big guys go in there, we just go wherever they're going to go. So this company actually was in the process of packing up their offices in Bangalore and moving to Hyderabad and Pune, because that's where the big guys were going, the big companies were going. And this was a firm of about 100 employees. So they weren't going to hire Arthur Andersen or McKinsey to do the work, but they figured if Oracle and Microsoft is going. But one thing that comes up a lot in the countries where I'm working is policymakers have a desire to be the next Silicon Valley, or sometimes, believe it or not, they actually want to be the next Detroit. And so this, yes, that's right. But this literally came out of a policymaker, a very high-level minister said, our vision is for this to be Detroit. So they've invested a lot of money to bring BMW, Ford. This is right outside of Chennai. There's an entire, it's a little Detroit now. But the idea is that in the 21st century, cities are being affected by, or the growth of cities are being affected by international real estate companies. They're being affected by international design firms. The idea of policymakers wanting their city to be the next bit, the next Detroit or Silicon Valley. Lots of developments in India and China and also in Africa that have names of former imperialists, or this is my personal favorite. Cape Cod is also in Bangalore. But in China, they've actually designed a number of developments that are named after, like, Kensington and Hampstead, et cetera. But this idea of importing certain lifestyles from elsewhere, the idea of being able to transport modernity is at a different scale. So in the 20th century, this happened as well. One of my colleagues at Stanford, my former colleagues at Stanford, Margaret O'Mara, is an urban historian. She and I used to have really long debates about whether this phenomenon is new, because she would say, if you looked at America and the development of urban America, this happened. We have a lot of developments in this country. I live in New Haven, which is a throwback to the British Empire. The names of places and ideas of places I would argue, yes, we had that before, but now it's at a very different scale, and the rapidity of change is very different today. The third question I have is, do our theories and models reflect and capture contemporary processes? And I just have one example here I'd like to highlight. I think there's one person in here who has a background in epidemiology. Yeah, I put this in here for you. So if we think about the process of urbanization, the physical process of urbanization, there are actually lots of links with infectious diseases, because a lot of this ends up being around fragmentation, around exposure to different habitats, interaction between humans and non-human species. This is a modification of some work done by Eric Lambon, where I looked at the land cover links with disease, and I thought, there's a lot of this actually have a very clear urban component to them. And yet, if you look at the urban and disease literature, a lot of that is also very simplistic. It doesn't really capture many of these nuances. I will say, though, that we're now at a time, this is an exciting time to study urbanization, because there are a lot of different discussions at national and international levels that's bringing urbanization into the fore. And I want to just highlight two that I've been part of. One is the new Sustainable Development Goals that was passed by UN member states last fall. The back page story, behind the scenes story, is that there was about a 2-year urban campaign to try to get member states to vote yes on a standalone urban sustainable development goal. And a lot of the reticence of the member states was that urban is so local, it's so not national, right? And the idea that a sustainable development goal, especially something that was passed by the UN, would be under the something that would be of national importance. So the fact that Goal 11 got passed is, I'd say, a big milestone in terms of bringing urbanization into an international discussion. We're now at a new phase where there's a need for research to identify and develop indicators and metrics for what this SDG would look like. How would we measure it? How do we know we're making progress? And one of the things that I keep arguing for is that we need to move away from thinking about urban sustainability as a local issue, because you cannot make Copenhagen sustainable without having, thinking about all the linkages to other places. The other big change in discourse and framing is around climate change. For years, the IPCC reports did not include a standalone chapter on cities. And the idea was that cities are not that important because they only take up 3% of the Earth's surface. And many of the IPCC chapters or the IPCC reports were organized around sectors: buildings, transport, land use, energy. And the idea was that cities would be examined through the lens of those other chapters. I was thrilled when, I guess it's like 6 years ago, when the IPCC plenary did pass a new chapter on urban mitigation. And little did I know I would spend 4 years of my life trying to do this. But what was really interesting for me in these national and international discussions was the framing was urbanization is not that different from just aggregation of people. So what is different about urban as opposed to just national statistics on population? So this is one of our conceptual diagrams from an early IPCC meeting, author meeting, where we said, where are the linkages between urban and emissions and energy use? And one of the things that we found was that there's a lot of research on these individual sectors, these different components. So we understand how buildings consume energy to build them, to construct them, and to operate them. We know a lot about transport energy and emissions. We know a lot about infrastructure. But it's this stuff in the middle, the linkages, that we know very, very little about. And moreover, the thing that really characterizes cities is not only the concentration of people, it's the spatial configuration of people. It's about where we live versus where we live, work. It's the spatial arrangement that makes cities very unique in terms of their impacts on the environment. So I'll leave you with this image of Shanghai in the 1970s and Shanghai today. These are really large-scale changes, and Maurice Strong had a prescient statement in 1992 that if we think about planetary level sustainability, we're going to have to really think about what happens in these cities and urbanization. And so with that, I'll open up for questions. Thank you.